Eva Braun has offered us this nifty chart of Odysseus's 12 labors. And the way that she set it up, you get to see the cyclical nature of things. She also emphasizes where Odysseus sleeps. I think that's actually important. Something that I want to talk about more deeply is why Odysseus falls asleep at these inopportune moments that actually cost him and cost his men their lives. And we get to see how going through these different adventures, there's actually quite a strong structure. And if you imagine Odysseus telling this story, or in reality, Homer telling this story, to have this level of narrative structure to the story is quite profound, especially if it was being sung improvisationally or is being composed of many different stories to put them in this order in this way. It's a beautiful structure to the story. Another book I've mentioned in addition to Eva Braun's Homeric Moments, which offers a world of wisdom, is Why Homer Matters by Adam Nicholson, just to highlight a couple of things in thinking about the Odyssey. As Eva Braun said, the Odyssey is really a collection of Odysseus's myths about himself. It's his imaginative journey as much as it is his physical and real journey. And what Nicholson emphasizes is that it becomes a human journey. These adventures constitute an enormous exploration of human consciousness. As we go island by island and point by point, and each story then adds another dimension for what it means to be a human being, what it means to be alive. So getting to read the truth of these stories is less a matter of the factual details or the geographical place, and more a matter of what it means to be alive as explored through Odysseus's imaginative reflections. The Odyssey then is a drama of oscillation between the inner world of Odysseus and the outer world he describes, between civilization and wildness, between enclosure, think of Circe the encircler, Calypso the one who conceals, and exposure, the memory of home, and then how the distance has actually helped him have a greater understanding of his home. The first adventure that Odysseus recalls is going to a real place where the men act like marauders or pirates. They have been at Troy for years, and now they're setting sail, and on their way home they stop and they destroy the island. It is a real place. You can find it. You can locate it on a map, and the men attack. And because of their greed, because of how much they take from the people there then rally and start killing them and destroying them, and they must flee from that island. From that place forward, there are no real geographical locations any longer, except potentially the Phaeacians themselves, which sound like an Edenic place, but Odysseus is talking to them as though they are real people at a real place. So we're kind of bookending with this real location, Ismaris and Phaeacia, and those kind of bookend our narrative. So we will return to a real place, and we begin with a real place. The next adventure is the island of the Lotus Eaters, and this starts rather banally, actually. The men go off and begin to eat these fruits, these flowers that make them no longer long for home. If you have ever read Rick Riordan's Percy Jackson stories, you get to see Percy Jackson has the same kind of feeling in Vegas where they get stuck in a Vegas location and they're eating and drinking the food offered to them there, which acts like the lotus flowers, making them no longer long to go on their journey to the underworld and instead want to stay where they are for all time. So it's a neat parallel with Vegas. I think that's a good modern understanding of what the Lotus Eaters represents imaginatively. Again, the truth of the narrative being revealed outside of the facts of the narrative, in which there probably is not a real place in which you can have this kind of lotus eater flower. But many of us journey to these places where we eat or drink and indulge to the point that we become lazy or slothful We indulge in things that make us no longer want to do the work that we need to do or go to the places that we need to go to. The most memorable adventure, the one that is sometimes just taken on its own and given in a story form apart from the rest of the narrative, is Odysseus and the Cyclops. Odysseus when he meets Polyphemus. We get to see Odysseus in his first weakness, right? We've seen him as a strong rhetorician, as a cunning man, as a wily man, as a man who longs to get home so much that it hurts. We've seen him as a hero up until this point, even encouraging his men not to maraude the island, not to be too greedy at Ismarus, and even when he gets to the Lotus Eaters, helping them, saving them, bringing them back to the island, figuring out that these flowers are the ones that are debilitating his men. When we get to the island of the Cyclops, we see Odysseus at fault. First, his curiosity gets the better of him. He wants to go over to the Cyclops island. Second, he brings wine in a constructed sack in which he hopes that the Cyclops or whoever inhabits this island will actually repay him with greater gifts. So he does want gifts. So he is not leading his men here to safety. He's not leading them home. He is looking for adventure. He has a wild recklessness that is going to get him into trouble here. And it does. They venture into the cave of the Cyclops, and even though everything around them, for such a smart man, should be signaling that they are dealing with a giant, they stay in the cave until the giant returns. And when he returns with his sheep and they are hiding in the cave, Odysseus recklessly goes forward and says, you know, we are men from Troy, and please give us gifts. And we get to see one of the prime examples of disrespect of Xenia by the Cyclops. On each island, Odysseus begins by saying, let's figure out who those men are, find out if they're wild, lawless aggressors, or the type to welcome strangers and fear the gods. And yet, when he interacts with the Cyclops, we discover he is not the kind who fears the gods. He has no fear of Zeus. His father is Poseidon, so he does have respect for one god in particular, but not for Zeus and not for Zeus's hospitality requirements for the stranger. Instead, he takes two of his men, he dashes them hard against the ground in line 290 like puppies, and the floor was wet with brains. He rips them limb by limb to make his meal, and then eats them like a lion on the mountain, devouring flesh, entrails, and marrow bones, and leaving nothing. And Odysseus says, we felt helpless. He then has to stay up all night thinking, what am I going to do? Odysseus faces one of his most difficult riddles at this moment, one that really requires the brain power of Odysseus, not the might of Achilles. In one way, if you had an Achilles-type hero in the Cyclops story, Achilles would charge and maybe he would be able to destroy Cyclops. The problem is if he destroys the Cyclops, there is a giant boulder in front of the cave, which none of the men can lift or get past, so they would starve to death eventually in that cave. Instead, he must somehow get the door opened by the Cyclops and be able to sneak past the Cyclops without being seen and get back to the ship. So he has quite a riddle in front of him, and this is how he solves it. He's very clever. He gets the Cyclops drunk on this wine that he brings with him, which apparently you need 12 cups of water for each cup of wine in order to dilute it. So it's quite strong, big enough for a giant, which just seems very providential, I guess, in this moment. And Cyclops gets drunk on this wine and says, I'm going to give you a gift, sarcastically to Odysseus. What's your name? Odysseus then shows his cleverness. He responds, my name is No Man. And Cyclops says, well, then I will kill you last, No Man. Then Odysseus rallies the 4 men that he has left with him, and they burn a stick over fire. They heat it up so much that it becomes a poker, and they insert it into the eye of the Cyclops, who wails with pain. The other Cyclopes on the island hear him and say, who's hurting you? What's happening? And the Cyclops yells, "No man is hurting me, no man is hurting me." And thus the trick of Odysseus works, right? No man is hurting me. Well, then go to bed, they all say. And he must whimper in pain in the cave and cannot grope for the men. Now, this is the second part of Odysseus' plan that works on his behalf. He hides each of the men between sheep. He loops them together so they're in between the fluffy wool of the sheep. So as the sheep are exiting and the Cyclops is feeling the fur, he only feels the sheep and doesn't feel the men that are hiding in between the wool. And then the ram, like Odysseus, as Priam had called him, right? He looks like a deep, fleecy ram. The ram, like Odysseus, hides under the belly of the ram and exits the cave of the Cyclops. And there's this kind of pathetic moment when the Cyclops pets the ram and talks to him like he's his own little pet, and you get this like softer side of the Cyclops, but it's a softer side for animals and not for human beings, and no respect for the gods. In a sense, it's a respect beast between beast almost. Both of them are animal. Well, Cyclops is an animal killer, even though he respects the actual animals. He kills humans. He's in a sense a cannibal, a beast among men. Here's the other part that really destroys Odysseus from being able to get home. Well, when Odysseus and his men and all the Greeks sacked Troy, the gods were so upset at how they sacked Troy that they said, "You're going to all take a long time getting home." So Nestor, Menelaus, all of them took longer to get home than they needed to because of the gods' will, because of how they had destroyed Troy, and they did not pillage the city in such a way that would have been respectful of the gods. Instead, they utterly destroyed it. They raped Cassandra. There were all of these horrible things that they did that they should have never done. And because of that, it's going to take them a while to get home. Well, it may have taken 3 years when it shouldn't have to get home. Instead, it's going to take Odysseus 10 years because of something else that he does. He causes his own suffering. If you remember in the opening of book 1, Zeus had mentioned, why is it that these men keep doing foolish things that causes them greater suffering than need be? He was speaking about Odysseus, right, who caused his own suffering. They warned him to relinquish the throne to Agamemnon, and he didn't. He instead kills Agamemnon and then dies himself. In the same way here, Odysseus could have just fled. He could have gone with his men. His men urge him, please don't egg on the Cyclops. Please don't tell the Cyclops who you are. But Odysseus cannot resist. Instead of leaving his identity as no man, he wants to claim his identity. He wants his kleos to reach the skies. And so he yells at Polyphemus, "I am the sacker of Troy. I am the son of Laertes who lives in Ithaca. That is the man who destroyed you. Remember his name. He is Odysseus." And this curses the rest of his journey. Polyphemus will then pray to Poseidon, "Grant that Odysseus, the city sacker, will never go back home." Or if it is fated, and remember the gods can't actually fight fate, if it is fated he will see his family, let him get there late and with no honor, in pain, lacking ships, having caused the death of all his men, and let him find trouble in his own home. This prophecy about Odysseus, that he will arrive late, he will arrive humiliated, he will lack all ships, and he will have caused the death of all his men and find trouble in his house. This will be repeated by Tiresias, it'll be repeated by Calypso, and it is the fate that actually he faces in the course of his adventures. The next adventure that is worth talking about is Circe the Encircler, Circe the Witch, and the story of the witch. Louis Markos, in another book that I have referenced before in our discussions of the Iliad, says in the book From Achilles to Christ that Circe symbolizes the practical lusts of the world. I think this is very insightful. We have seen that Xenia requires that a guest's needs be met, and then you ask who they are, and then you offer them gifts. As we saw in the Cyclops actually eats his guests rather than feeds his guests, and Circe feeds her guests poison so that they are no longer themselves and cannot reveal their identity. They actually become pigs. She uses her magic wand and then turns them all into pigs. So she is the opposite of a great host. But what she does offer them is nourishment but to the fullest, to the point of complete indulgence. Hermes will intervene here with Odysseus and give him an herb that warns him to stay away. Some people have noted that because Hermes' name then becomes the hermeneutic, right? He's a messenger god. He's the god of words. He's a god of interpretation. Then that this herb can symbolize that Odysseus is empowered against the physical lust that Circe inspires with a divine gift, right? With the divine words given by Hermes, that he can withstand this physical lust. And so Circe will offer this to Odysseus. He will stand strong against her, demand that his men then be turned into human beings again, but then he gives in to the lust. He stays there. And what Marcos mentions is that she turns them all into metaphoric pigs then still, because they all stay, they get drunk, they eat until they're full, and Odysseus himself will stay in her bed making love for a year when his own wife is waiting for him to come home. I think Lewis is on to something here, Dr. Marcos, when he says this, not only about Hermes and the inspiration of the word, but also that she represents imaginatively the opposite of what Penelope would offer. The opposite of what Penelope would offer Odysseus. That Circe, even though she's weaving and singing, she's singing and weaving more like Calypso than she is like Penelope. She is trying to trap them. She's trying to encircle them into a love of the things that are of the world. And it is only when she tells them that they must go to Hades that things begin to switch for Odysseus, where once he's facing a similar kind of charm with Calypso, he rejects that in a way that he accepted and acquiesced to the desires of Circe. So something happens in the journey to the underworld that will actually change Odysseus's desires from the lusts of the world and for the lusts of adventure, the man of curiosity that he was prior to the visit in the underworld, and to the different kind of man post-underworld adventure.